That one. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this meeting of the Western Area Planning Committee of Wiltshire Council. It's just after 3 o'clock, so time to begin. I am Christopher Newbury. I'm the chairman for today. On my left is Kieran Elliott, who is our Democratic Services Officer. On my right is Janice Green, who is the case officer for the Town and Village Green application around Southwick Court. And on my farther right is Mr. Slack, who is our legal consultant on Town and Village Greens. And I will just go for the first item to Kieran. Kieran, apologies.
Thank you, Chairman. We've had apologies from Councillor Suzanne Wickham, who will be substituted by Councillor Mike Sankey. We've also had apologies from Councillor Bill Parks, who has not been substituted.
Thank you, Kieran. Bill Parks did ask me to make a point of saying that he had got urgent other business and that he had not been able to find a substitute, and he did regret not being able to be with us today. So we don't have any. Do we have any other apologies? No, I think the rest of us are here. Councillor Seed.
I did speak to Bill on the weekend. Can we make, as a committee, or could you make a representation to the leader that we need more substitutes for this committee? The reason he couldn't get a substitute is that there just simply weren't any.
I'm happy to do that. Does everybody agree? Does anybody have any objection to that being done? I mean, clearly it would apply across the political groups, because the way Wiltshire Council does it is that only a member of the same group can substitute for you. So if you wanted me to do that, it would not be only a Conservative.
If I recall, we were told we were limited by numbers, and then subsequently that, I believe, has been changed. So if we could get more, Kieran may know more.
Kieran has something to say. Kieran.
Yes, as part of the constitutional changes adopted on the 16th of May, there is now not a upper limit on the number of group substitutes for committee meetings. So you could appoint 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 group substitutes for each planning committee.
Thank you, Kieran. That's helpful. The only limitation comes from the Wiltshire Council's own constitution. So bearing that in mind, is everybody happy for me to, it would not only be the leader, I suppose, it would be the other groups as well. But there is a particular problem, I think, with the Conservative group. I think that's the reality, isn't it? And Ernie wanted to say something as well. Ernie?
Thanks, Chairman. I was just going to say, I thought it had already been decided that we were going to increase the number of substitutes. Presumably it's just got to wait until full council when group leaders can put their nominations forward.
Okay, so in that case, shall we, if you believe that that is going to happen at the next full council, Ernie, are you happy, Jonathan, that we just sort of send a few words in support of that happening and to send it to the group leader, sorry, to Councillor Clure with a copy to the other group leaders, just to, I'm just trying to feel the way forward there. Is that okay, Ernie?
Yeah, absolutely, Chairman.
Just to say that it came up at today's Western Area Planning
Compared to what Kieran
Committee.
was saying, I'd just like to say if only the independent group could put 10 substitutes up, but we'll do our best.
Well, nothing to stop you. I mean, that would be my approach. I have to say that would be my approach, given the limitation imposed by Wiltshire Council, to simply put up the names of all group members. It would be perfectly sensible. Right, okay, well, thank you for raising that point, Councillor Seed. We'll move on then, I think, to the next business. Oh, I beg your pardon, Councillor Viger.
Yeah, sorry, on that, I was just thinking that might be exactly what would happen, and then you'd have a situation where all the members on each of the groups were all substitutes for all of the committees if you open the floodgates. So I would suggest that possibly we suggest doubling it to 4 rather than 2, or to 5 perhaps, as a sort of like to contain it a bit so that we don't.
I think it's going to be up to each political group, actually, Councillor Viger. I mean, clearly it would open the floodgates to not limiting ourselves any more than the law does. But, I mean, it's going to be up to the political group. So I think if you're happy, I will just pass a note to the leader with a copy to the other group leaders to say that it was raised.
If I could just help it.
Councillor Seed?
Yeah, your problem comes is with the Conservative group effectively, because we've got I think 7 or 8 members on here, and we've only got something like 12 or 14 members in the area, whatever it is, and we're constantly struggling to get substitutes. And today you've got a position where we've got less than the allowed number of members at this committee, and we ought to be trying to achieve full representation. That is the reason I make the point.
Thank you, Councillor Seed. So we are the elephant in the room, and we will, I tell you what, I will word a suitably cautious note to come from the committee, and I will circulate it for anybody to comment on before it goes across. Is that okay, Ernie?
Just to say, Chairman, whilst I agree with what Councillor Seed's saying, it's a bit ironic that since the regulations forbid any political aspect on decision making, that it should really be irrelevant what political group you're from on this committee.
Yeah, the Councillor Carbin.
You're also restricted to this area. For example, I'm on the Southern Area Committee, so you can take substitutes from outside of West Wiltshire District Council area.
Yes, indeed, and we have had members on this committee who were not from the Western area. This is not an area committee. This is a committee of the council, and anyone from anywhere in Wiltshire can be appointed to it and can replace any member on it at a meeting. It's, as you say, that's the way it is. And whoever just pointed it out that it's the Conservative group which is the problem, it clearly is so. But anyway, never mind. I think I will feel my way forward on that one, and we will send something to be approved by all of you, just to rub in that we could do with some extra substitutes on the Western area, particularly for the Conservative group. Shall we then move on? The minutes of the previous meeting are circulated. Does anyone have any additions or corrections or any objections of any kind to those minutes? I'm looking all around and not seeing any, so I will move that we approve them. Somebody to second, please. Councillor Ernie Clark. All in favour, please wave. Any against? Any abstentions? Okay, those are approved, and I will sign them at the end. Declarations of interest. This, I hasten to add, is only for members of Wiltshire Council, not for anyone else, not for members of the public, not for officers of the council, only members. Do any members of Wiltshire Council have any declarations of interest to declare in the item on our, well, either of the items, I suppose? Anything at all? I don't see anyone indicating. So on to the chairman's announcements. The only chairman's announcements are the usual ones. First of all, could I ask everyone to switch your mobiles to silent, just so that nobody is suddenly interrupted when speaking, and I will do that myself. We have not been informed of any fire drill, so if the fire alarm goes off, it will probably be a real fire, and Kieran on my left will quickly tell you how to get out of the building quickly and safely. I will in a moment go through the public participation. I beg your pardon, Councillor
Is there
Palmer.
an appeals update? Because it doesn't seem to be on the agenda at all, and yet I know of an appeal that's gone through.
That's a very good point. I don't see an appeals update on the agenda, so it may be that perhaps there are not any. But anyway, as we don't have an appeals update and we don't have any planning officers supporting us today, we can't even ask Kenny, who is not with us, if he knows of anything that's come in late. So we'll just have to wait, I think, until the next meeting. Well, do you want to tell us? I mean, I don't see why you shouldn't just tell us briefly under Chairman's announcements.
Yeah, I mean, there's a construction that went ahead without planning permission on Newtown, a steel structure that's gone up. And that was the planning decision there was appealed, and the appeal was refused. So we're working with enforcement to make sure that construction is reversed.
Is that a porch? Remind us what it is.
It's 2 stories above a pizza place that was initially a 1-story building. Steel structure went up.
Oh, I've noticed that.
Yeah.
Bare iron girders sticking up
Yeah.
into the air, somebody aspiring to put more on
Yes,
top.
who took Gove's sort of initiative of you can convert above your shop into accommodation a little too literally.
Okay, well, thank you for telling us. And we no doubt we'll hear in due course whether the enforcement action has speedily succeeded. We will, Kieran, could we just minute that we allowed Councillor Palmer to refer to that matter? The next item then is public participation. Do we, Kieran, have any questions that we've been given notice of? Okay, so we have no public questions. For the benefit of those who are not familiar with our meetings, I will just outline how this procedure for today goes. First of all, an officer, who today is Janice Green, will present a report and explain the recommendation. Secondly, I will ask members of the committee and any other members of the council who happen to be in the room if they have any questions to the officer about the report. The officer will have a chance to reply. Thirdly, we go to the public participation section, and we do have, Kieran, do you have the list of people who've signed in to speak? I will just tell people, just to confirm for you whether you are or are not formally registered. I have Councillor Graham Hill, who is a supporter of the application. I have Jeff Whiffen, who is a supporter. I have Mr. Francis Morland, who is just making a comment. General comment. So I have the three of you, and you each have, no one is representing a town or parish council? Speaking in their personal quote. So you each have up to 3 minutes if you need it. The local unitary member may then speak prior to debate. I mean, this is slightly complicated because the land is in Councillor Horace Prickett's area, and the applicant and the area of benefit stated by the applicant is in Trowbridge. But I think we're going to be looking to Councillor David Lovell to act as the local member for today. I beg your pardon. I'm getting you confused. This is crumbling brain cells. We did have a Councillor David Lovell who is still in the offing and was not a Trowbridge member. So I'm very sorry about that, Councillor Viger. But anyway, you are going to be treated as a local member for today. May then speak prior to debate or open the debate. But as you're a member of the committee, I'll call on you to open the debate. The first member to speak is asked to move a motion, so we will be looking to Councillor Lovell to move something. At the end of the debate, we will have a vote. And I do ask members of the public, please not to interrupt when we are debating this, because we can get into hot water if we allow that to happen. So we now come to item 6 on the agenda, which is the only business for today, Commons Act 2006, application to register land as a town or village green, Southwick Court Fields. I invite Janice Green to take us through her report on this application.
Thank you, Chair. If I could start by adding a correction and an update to the report. Firstly, at Appendix 17, officers' comments on the legal tests. At paragraph 95, the representations included here are attributed to the objector. However, the comments are those of the applicant, with apologies for this error. Additionally, please note an update on position of Councillor Graham Hill of Trowbridge Town Council. Councillor Hill is no longer acting as Trowbridge Mayor or Deputy. However, he remains as Trowbridge Town Councillor for Grove Ward. So this is a matter of an application made to Wiltshire Council as the Commons Registration Authority to register land located at Southwick Court Fields to the southwest of Trowbridge in the parishes of Southwick and North Bradley as a town or village green. The application is made under section 15(1) of the Commons Act 2006, which states that any person may apply to register land as a town or village green where subsection 2, 3 or 4 applies. So in this case, the application is made under subsection 15(2) of the 2006 Act, where it is claimed that a significant number of inhabitants of any locality or neighbourhood within a locality have indulged as of right in lawful sports and pastimes on the land for a period of at least 20 years, and they continue to do so at the time of application. This is the legal test to be applied in this case, and where the application is made in 2020, the 20-year user period in question is 2000 to 2020, with use continuing at the time of application. The application is made by Mr. N. Swanee as a local resident. Southwick and North Bradley Parish Councils and Trowbridge Town Council support the application. The application was received by Wiltshire Council as the Commons Registration Authority on the 30th of November 2020 and date stamped accordingly. The land subject to the application is in the ownership of the Right Honourable Mrs. S. Rees and Mr. and Mrs. Marshall. 49 parties provide evidence in support of the application, and there is one objection from the landowner, the Right Honourable Mrs. S. Rees. Wiltshire Council, as the registration authority, must remain neutral and determine the application in a manner which is fair and reasonable to all parties. Growth and Infrastructure Act of 2013 introduced a series of provisions to make it more difficult to register land as a town or village green, amid concerns that these applications were being used as a method to thwart planning outside the planning framework. This included, at Section 16, the insertion of Section 15C into the Commons Act 2006, which excludes the right to apply to register land where certain planning trigger events have occurred. For example, a live planning application or inclusion of the land in a publicised draft or adopted development plan which identify the application land for development. Upon receipt of an application to register land as a town or village green, the registration authority must consult with the planning authorities and consider planning trigger events which would extinguish the right to apply. The application cannot be accepted where there is a valid planning trigger event in place over the whole of the application land, and where only part of the application land is affected by a trigger event, the application may be processed as normal, excluding the affected area. The right to apply to register land is revived where a corresponding planning terminating event has occurred. For example, where a planning application is refused and all means of challenge of the decision are exhausted and the decision upheld, or a draft development plan is withdrawn or adopted, or a development plan is revoked, or policies relevant to the land superseded. In this case, the planning authorities confirmed 2 planning trigger events in place over the land without corresponding terminating events. Firstly, the inclusion of part of the land in the adopted Wiltshire Housing Sites Allocation Plan, and secondly, an outline planning application for 180 houses and associated infrastructure over part of the land. With that in mind, if we now look at the application plan, the original application to register land as a town or village green covered the whole of the area outlined red. However, upon confirmation of the presence of planning trigger events on part of the land, the hatched red area, which extinguished the right to apply to register that section of the land, the town or village green application was accepted only in part over the unhatched application area to the south of the site. The Commons Registration Authority continues to determine the application as normal on the section of the application land unaffected by the planning trigger events. That's approximately 13 acres. So the identification of a locality or neighbourhood within a locality is important in the application. If the application is successful and the land is registered as a town or village green, it is only the inhabitants of that locality or neighbourhood who will have the right to use the land for lawful sports and pastimes. In this case, the applicant identifies Grove Ward, Trowbridge as the relevant locality, as shown outlined on the plan submitted by the applicant here, and located to the north of the application land. Indeed, 44 of the 49 parties providing evidence in this case are residents of Grove Ward, where addresses are provided. So we have included some photographs of the application land with a map indicating the approximate location of the photographs. So this is the application land looking generally northwest. This is the existing style in the southern boundary of the application land on footpath number 3, Southwick, which crosses the land. This is looking generally southwest, and you can see there the bridge over the Lambrook stream, which forms the southern boundary of the application land. So this is the application land looking north, and the application land looking generally east. So it's a large open area laid to grass, crossed by recorded public rights of way and also unrecorded tracks. So the application land, looking generally northwest, the application includes an enclosed area off Axe and Cleaver Lane at the southeast corner of the site, which appears to have been inaccessible to local inhabitants. And for that reason, it is proposed to exclude this area from the registered land if the application is successful. In addition to that area, it is also proposed to exclude an area of Pennings at the northwest corner of the application land from the registered area if the application to register the land as a town or village green is successful, as that also appears to have been inaccessible to local inhabitants. The two enclosed areas proposed to be excluded are shaded blue on the plan. So in order for the application to be successful, each element of the legal test as set out at section 15.2 of the Commons Act 2006 must be met. The burden of proof lies with the applicant and the registration authority has no investigative powers in this matter. The standard of proof is the balance of probabilities, i.e. that it is more likely than not that local inhabitants have acquired a right to exercise lawful sports and pastimes on the land. Evidence is key, and there are no other considerations in the determination of the application. In this case, the evidence of whether or not a significant number of inhabitants of any locality or of any neighbourhood within a locality have indulged as of right in lawful sports and pastimes on the land for a period of at least 20 years, with use continuing at the time of application, is in dispute. In particular, whether the main use of the land for walking and fruit picking is attributable to the exercise of a right-of-way along a defined route or qualifying wider use of the land for lawful sports and pastimes. Registration Authority has a duty at common law to process applications made under section 15.1 of the Commons Act 2006 in a fair and reasonable manner, and the decision on the application is open to legal challenge. There is no clear guidance available to authorities regarding when it is appropriate to hold a non-statutory public inquiry. However, this is considered in the case of R on the application of Whitney versus Commons Commissioners of 2004 in the Court of Appeal, which sets out that a public inquiry should be held where there is serious dispute of fact, which is likely to be resolved by hearing from the witnesses, or the matter is of great local interest. An inspector appointed by the Registration Authority to preside over the inquiry will hear evidence from all parties and produce a recommendation to the Registration Authority to assist in its determination of the application. There is no requirement for the Registration Authority to follow the inspector's recommendation. However, any alternative decision must be supported by clear evidential reasons. And oral evidence provided at the public inquiry may be given additional weight where it is subject to cross-examination. So in this case, the officer's recommendation is that where there is a significant dispute of the evidence, to appoint an independent inspector on behalf of the Commons Registration Authority to provide over a non-statutory public inquiry at which the evidence of all parties will be heard and tested through cross-examination, and to produce an advisory report and recommendation regarding the application to the Western Area Planning Committee to assist the Commons Registration Authority in its determination of the application to register land as a town or village green at Southwick Courtfields in the parishes of Southwick and North Bradley as soon as reasonably practicable. So the committee in this case is acting in its regulatory function, which requires the committee to act in a quasi-judicial capacity. When the committee acts in this capacity, it must follow the proper procedure which accords with the requirements of natural justice and the right to a fair hearing. If the committee uses its powers to determine the application against the officer's recommendation to hold a non-statutory public inquiry, the committee must give legally valid reasons for this determination, which must be supported by evidence. We have received some additional correspondence from Mr. Francis Morland to update the committee on a planning appeal regarding the planning application in this case. So if I just read that email out for you. In respect of the portion of the application land cross-hatched in red on the application land as being subject to planning trigger events and thereby excluded from the application, I believe it would be helpful to draw the meeting's attention to the planning appeal and the references given by Waterton Park, lodged on the 11th of May 2023 and registered yesterday by the Planning Inspectorate and to be conducted by the inquiry procedure. So in response to that, this information relates to an appeal against Wiltshire Council's decision to refuse the planning application for 180 houses on part of the application land. Planning matters are only relevant in this case insofar as they relate to the existence of planning trigger and terminating events on the land and their effect upon the right to apply to register land as a town or village green. In effect, the appeal has no real effect on the planning trigger events in place on the land, as the planning application remains a valid trigger event until all means of challenge are exhausted and the decision is upheld. So that's a refusal. So the appeal is not a terminating event which would revive the right to apply on that part of the land. And in any case, in this particular case, the with the Wiltshire Housing Sites Allocation Plan forms a second trigger event in place on the same part of the land, which remains even if the planning application were to fall away. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Questions to the officer? I have a couple, but let me go first to members of the committee. Councillor Seed.
Yeah, in the report, there's some reference to fruit pickers. Are we looking at activity which is legal? And is fruit picking, i.e. taking of fruit, visiting to take fruit, presumably without permission, a legal activity? And therefore, should we be considering that as an activity to support this application?
Thank you, Councillor Seed. I think that's a question. It might be helpful. Janice, are you happy if I go to Mr. Slack on that? I mean, clearly that could be quite a knotty matter, Mr. Slack.
Yeah, I think it would depend on the circumstances. If the owners of the land had indicated that they objected to fruit picking, then of course it would be illegal or could be deemed to be illegal. I think fruit picking in hedgerows is generally a custom in the English countryside, but I think if it went on somebody else's land and they were opposed to people fruit picking on the land, then I think that would make it illegal.
So is your premise, and I did want to explore this a bit, that somebody can go onto someone's land, take something, and that's fine unless the owner's already said they object to it?
No, I think that's perhaps too broad an interpretation of what I said. I think it's so much part of the fruit picking is so much part of the English rural way of life that to deem it a crime, I think would be excessive.
I'm not talking about a crime. I'm talking about whether it is a permissible activity on somebody's land to visit that land in order to remove fruit.
I think Mr. Slack is saying that picking hedgerow fruit like blackberries and hips and haws is one thing, and more formal fruit that is grown for profit would be another matter.
Yes, I think that's a very good way of putting it, Chairman. Yes.
And I suppose following on from that, would blackberrying and picking rose hips, would that be a sport or pastime, or would it be something different, I wonder?
I think it's probably a pastime, I would suggest, isn't it? Possibly neither, I think.
Well, that would perhaps be a matter for the inspector, I guess.
Yes.
Thank you, Councillor C. Do you have any other questions? I'm not seeing any other hands. I beg your pardon. I have lots of hands now. Let's go to Councillor Weiger and then Councillor Carbin and then Councillor Clark.
Thank you very much. Just in terms of the evidence for the 20 years of use without let or stay and the strength of the evidence, there are in the appendices where people have supported the application some assertions by people that they have used the land for more than 20 years. Presumably what we're saying is that we as a Commons Registration Authority don't have the powers to sort of interrogate that evidence and determine whether or not it's correct, but an inspector would be able to look, to test that evidence and to try and probe as to whether there was something that is stronger evidence or even proof. Is that where we are?
Yes, that's correct. In these cases, Wiltshire Council, as the Commons Registration Authority, doesn't have the investigative powers, but where there is dispute of the evidence and we go forward to the public inquiry, the inspector can hear evidence from the witnesses and then cross-examine that evidence. And that oral evidence, although we have the written evidence here before us, that oral evidence given at the public inquiry and tested can be given additional weight.
And before the public inquiry, would there be a call for people to submit further evidence, or would it simply be carried out on the basis of the evidence that's been submitted for this application so far?
Of course, any additional evidence can forward at any time. What the inspector will do is send out a series of directions for the inquiry on how the inquiry is going to be run. They will probably go to the applicant in this case, who may then call witnesses to give further evidence on that.
And irrespective of the appeal, am I understanding you to say that even if the appeal were rejected, that would not be a terminating event because the land is still allocated for housing by Wiltshire Council in its local plan? So the land would actually have to be withdrawn from the local plan in order to have a terminating event?
Yes, that's correct. In this application, we actually have two planning trigger events which cover the same area of land, so the area hatched red. Even if the planning application went through the appeal process and the decision was upheld, and that fell away as a planning trigger event, there is still the allocation of the land in the Wiltshire Housing Sites Allocation Plan, which is a separate trigger event. And unless parts of that are revoked or superseded, that would still remain as a valid planning trigger event, which would prevent the right to apply on the same section of land.
Thank you very much.
Councillor Carbin. Councillor Clark.
Chairman, just a daft question, really. The northwest corner, you say it's used for pennings or... I've not actually been able to find out what pennings is or are. Just if you could give a very, very, very brief description.
Of course, yes. So the northwest corner, which you see here, which we're proposing, if the application is successful, to be excluded, appears to have been an area of pens for animals. I'm not sure, sorry. That probably wasn't terribly clear. But yes, and it appears to have been inaccessible for some years to local inhabitants. Obviously, evidence may come out that it has been used at the public inquiry, but these are the types of issues that the public inquiry will be looking to drill down into by hearing from the witnesses and what they've been doing on the land.
Thank you, Councillor Clark. That was going to be one of my questions. I was curious about these two areas of solid blue. And clearly, when officers say that they appear to have been inaccessible, that I gather will be an issue for the non-statutory inquiry to look at and for evidence to be heard on, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so clearly that would be a matter for the inspector. My other question was going to be, and is, here it comes, we now know about the trigger events. The planning application is quite straightforward. Presumably it's the making of a planning application and the registering of a planning application which triggers that. Is there an end to that? Does that trigger event last forever? Or does it have some, does that mean that the land can never be applied for as a town or village green, or does it expire sooner or later? Can you tell us?
Yes, so as I say, we have two planning trigger events in place on the land. So the planning application is probably the easier to be sort of done away with if the planning application goes all the way through to appeal and the decision to refuse that planning application is upheld. Once the appeal, the means of appeal appealing that planning application in the UK are exhausted, that terminating event actually, that becomes a terminating event, which then revives the right to apply. But as I say here, we have also the Wiltshire Housing Sites Allocation Plan, which is also a planning trigger event. That's probably slightly more difficult for the terminating event to occur, because it would mean the revoking of parts of the plan, or also parts of it being superseded.
Thank you, that's very helpful, but clearly not impossible. But it would be a matter for the local plan revision as to whether anything changed. Okay, well, clearly it seems that Mr. Swanee missed the implications of those trigger events coming along. With the allocation of the land, do you happen to know, this is quite knotty and this is not relevant to this, but members might like to know for similar situations elsewhere. With the allocation of the land, do you know whether it is a trigger event the moment the council publishes a draft allocation, or is it only a trigger event when the council actually allocates following the long and difficult statutory process?
Yes, there are a series of planning trigger and terminating events, and one of the planning trigger events is the publication of a draft local plan which identifies the land for development. Then once that plan is actually adopted, it becomes an entirely separate trigger event. So the adopted development plan is a separate trigger event, which then takes effect. So you have the draft, which is a trigger event, and then the adopted plan is a different trigger event, which then extinguishes the right to apply.
Okay, I think that's very helpful, though it does seem rather unfair that somebody could be prevented from applying for a town or village green simply by, out of the blue, a draft plan allocation is published, as indeed some will be published very shortly, I suppose. Okay, but there you are. That's the answer to my question. Are there any other questions? I beg your pardon. Councillor Kerr, yeah.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Can I just ask about the, I'm a bit confused with the footpaths and the tracks. Can you just explain the differences? Because we've got like a little purple section in the bottom corner where I think the photo B is. Can I just have sort of an explanation of which ones of those are legal, if any of them are not legal, I suppose, and the difference between a path and a footpath? Thank you.
Yes, of course. So a plan of the land with rights of way shown on it is included at page 263 of the report. That's Appendix 17. So the routes that you see there, so for example, you've got SWCK3, they are the recorded public rights of way over the land. But we have noted, and aerial photographs that we've included in the report, and also evidence from the applicant as well, have shown a number of unrecorded unrecorded tracks across the land, which people appear to be using in addition to the routes which are recorded in the definitive map and statement of public rights of way. So there are sort of unofficial routes over the land, as well as the official.
Does that answer your question, Councillor Kerr?
Know where the footpath, I don't understand on the purple. I'm looking at page, I don't know what page it is on the report, page 160, and there's a purple section which I presume is a footpath. I know footpaths don't normally go, sometimes don't go anywhere, but then it seems to go on to a black line, which we call principal circular path. So is that principal circular path? Because people are just cutting across. I don't understand that. If someone can explain that picture to me, I'd be grateful. I think is the one I'm confused about. Thank you, Chair.
Janice Green.
Thank you. Yes, so this is a map with routes which has been submitted by the applicant in this case. As far as the rights of way department are concerned, there are only a certain number of recorded public rights of way over the land. So I think here the applicant is just highlighting additional routes over the land that people appear to be using.
Sorry, can I come back, Chair? So the yellow one is actually the continuation of the purple one. Is that right on that map? Because that is a footpath, isn't it, I suppose? Does that purple section you can see on that little map extend across the yellow? But the yellow on here is down as a secondary internal path. But on that map in front of us, it's marked as a footpath.
So the official rights of way are included on the map at 263, and anything additional that you see on the map on page 160 appear to be the routes that the applicant has identified, which are being used in addition to the existing rights of way. So I think the one coming north to south is probably indicating the existing right of way.
If you look at page 161, although it is very faint indeed, you can see that an aerial photograph is actually showing something very, very similar to what is on page 160, which presumably is actual wear on the ground, where people's feet have been walking or animals' feet have been walking. But that doesn't mean that there is a right-of-way recorded. It means that there is a path being used, which may or may not have been used for long enough that somebody could at some point claim its use as a right. Is that, are we getting there?
Yeah, well, I think what I'm going to do is
Chairman,
just ignore that
Page
map.
4 of the agenda, which has got the ordnance survey map. If you enlarge that, you can see the footpaths as listed in the ordnance survey map, and it's on page 4 of our agenda.
Yeah, I think that one's actually more clear. What I'm getting is confusing looking at the other map. It's got like yellow and different colours where I think it should be purple because it is a right of way.
Thank you, Councillor Davis, but clearly you're talking about recorded rights of way, which is slightly different. Mr. Sack, did you want to add anything on that? Okay, are there any other questions to the officers on the report? If not, then we can move on to the public participation. And I now need to go back to the sheet that I had a moment ago. Thank you very much, Kieran. So I take the three speakers in the order that I read them out. First of all, Graham Hill, are you there? Right, over to you, and you have up to 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Before I begin, can I pass on Mr. Swanee's apologies? He's currently significantly unwell, intubated, and not able to even get up a flight of stairs. I'd like to pick up a couple of points within the letters of objection. 1.3 alleges that this application is submitted to frustrate the now failed application for H26 when it lies outside of the developable red line. 4.3 incorrectly claims that no reference to 20+ years access has been made. The site has been repeatedly defined by Wiltshire Council in their submissions across a range of documents to the 29 WHSAP inspection as being jointly or wholly used for informal recreation. This was not challenged at the time, but only in response to this application. 5.10 is a presumption with no evidence base. Section 5.2 appears to suggest that additional trackways not covered by footpath legislation are to be considered as public rights of way. In 5.26, a DMMO should therefore be submitted to confirm this upgraded status, or else free roaming accepted as occurring. 5.29 references the stopping up of a public right of way. In comments on objection, photographs of gates are shown across the major footpath as being locked, with public notifications of this application being removed. This is explained as damage prevention. Since 2019, large numbers of contractors have accessed H26 with many vehicles. Some of these are referenced in the DAS at the time of the damage. Works include drilling and monitoring boreholes and test pits, locating both gas and water mains, monitoring drainage points, assessing and recording topography, and associated survey works. The likelihood of sections of fence being cut and removed by these contractors for access is greater than that of damage by dog walkers. Presumption of damage by the public rather than contractors raises the issue of awareness. The landowner apparently would be aware of children camping out overnight or playing with balls or frisbees, but not of work conducted by significant numbers of medium-sized vehicles and their crews. It should be noted that between the application site and the residence of the landowner, there are 6 acres of woodland in third-party ownership, blocking all sight lines from the residence. In the submitted DAS, the applicant states their intention to retain this land as public open space or parkland at sections 1.2.7, the introduction to section 3.0, within section 4.0, in section 4.8.11, as well as sections 4.9.7, 4.9.8 and 4.9.9, and shown as such on the site master plan at 5.0 with detail at 5.7. These proposals, submitted on behalf of the landowner through their agents and representatives, illustrate that there is no plan to return the land to grazing and that the public desires and plans of the landowner are fully reflected in this application. Since this application conforms with the expressed desires of the landowner through their various agents, might I suggest that a compromise could be that a legally binding commitment to those expressed desires be created that might enable Mr. Swaney to remove his application, with all parties being equally content with the result at no further cost of money or time. And can I conclude by thanking the officer for such an in-depth and accurate report?
Thank you very much. I think that is probably more a matter for the inquiry than for us, but of course we haven't yet decided whether to set up such an inquiry, so you're right to raise it with us. Councillor, or rather Jeff Whiffen, who is a supporter, over to you, and you have up to 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. My family and myself have had unhindered access for the past 26 years while living adjacent to the fields this application refers to. There has never been any restrictions on access of any kind until the gates were locked after the publication of this application. I have read the submissions and feel your attention should be drawn to the following to make matters clearer. This application in no way interferes with the allocation of site H26 in respect of either its failed application or possible appeal. The application supports Wiltshire Council policy with direct reference to Core Policy 29, is a policy in the core strategy which protects the character and identity of Southwick and North Bradley as separate communities. Integral to this is the preservation of the undeveloped countryside that lies between them, and also Core Policy 51. I would like to explain some detail about the Core Policy 51 in here. It reads, Wiltshire Core Strategy CP51 Green Infrastructure. If damage or loss of existing green infrastructure is unavoidable, the creation of new or replacement green infrastructure equal to or above its current value and quality that maintains the integrity and functionality of the green infrastructure network will be required. Proposals for major development should be accompanied by an audit of the existing green infrastructure within and around the site, and a statement demonstrating this will be retained and enhanced through development process. And when referencing policy CP51 in response to the site selection process, Natural England responded as follows. We are unaware of any such audits being undertaken since the core strategy was adopted, and our impression is that compensatory provision has rarely, if ever, been made. And we are very concerned that the allocation of such sites will result in a loss of recreational amenity. As such, without confirmation that a robust approach will be taken to implementing MPPF Power 74 and 75 and CP51, we advise that the plan is unsound. This application is constrained by the proposed site of H26, which is currently in a state of rejection from this council. If it were to be subject to an appeal, and that appeal be successful, the adoption of this site as a village green would support Wiltshire Council in meeting the requirements of its own policies. While this is not directly related to the application here today, it does represent joined-up thinking in preserving and honouring policies in a timely manner. The note of objection makes several unsupported and evidence-free assumptions and assertions and frames them as reasonable and factual. but provides no evidence whatsoever to support those statements. If evidence must be produced for one side of the argument, then surely the burden should fall equally. Much is made of the landowner being made aware or unaware of events between the residents of the landowner, and this application lies 6 acres of heavily wooded land in third-party ownership. It is not unreasonable to ask how this daily awareness of activity will have occurred. The matter of evidence is repeatedly raised. There is no evidence to the contrary presented, and yet the absence of documentary evidence 2 decades ago is presented as crucial to the application. I have a camera on my phone, but do not regularly take pictures of my daily activities, especially not in the expectation of needing those pictures 20 years later. The comments relating to the lack of evidence are neither helpful nor appropriate for ordinary people. I believe that the objection rests on the format of presentation within a court of law. In such circumstances, the testimony of a witness of good character is given significant weight. I believe this application has been supported by North Bradley Parish Council, Southwick Parish Council, several current and former town and county councillors, former and current mayors and deputy
Mr. Whiffen,
mayors.
you are well over time. Could you wind up, please?
The compliance with and support of CP 29 and CP 51 need to be addressed and included in the consideration of this application. The crux of the matter is that no change to current free use, access and possible future cattle grazing, if a return to mixed use happens, is proposed, and that the application serves only to meet the requirements of policy whilst retaining unfettered use of the application site for residents and the local population as a whole. The landowner stands to lose nothing. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Whippen. And then finally, Mr. Morland, I think you will have heard, Mr. Morland, that Janice Green read out your email. You are, of course, welcome to add anything you wish.
Thank you, Chair. Well, it was that it does seem to me that, notwithstanding what others have said, that the driving force for this application may well have been to prevent the development at Southwick Court Fields, the allocation of development at Southwick Court Fields, and the refusal of the planning application earlier this year would have led some people to believe that there was some mileage there. But as I say, the applicants have now lodged an appeal. It was registered on the by the planning inspectorate yesterday, and there's going to be an inquiry on that. And I suspect that that inquiry will attract rather more interest than the Commons registration inquiry or the process which you're contemplating in respect to this application. When I first got involved in town and village green issues, it was under the long before the Commons Act of 2006. And although the Commons Act of 2006 didn't change the provisions significantly, the case law that has come forth over the years, and some of it, as you look at your agenda, you'll see predates 2006, has in effect interpreted particular words and particular concepts in so much detail that the establishment of town and village greens has become progressively more and more difficult. And I, having read much of this this case law, I reached the conclusion that pursuing town and village green applications was not really much of a way forward, as it was when I was involved originally. But what this application has done is to draw in a whole lot of very interesting new issues particularly about how Section 15C works, that's these trigger events, and also when part of the site, but not the whole of the site, is affected by the trigger. And the other issue is is where you've got the claimed locality for is Grove Ward Trowbridge here, but the application site itself doesn't include any of Trowbridge and is wholly within the parishes of Southwick and North Bradley. The particular query that I had on these trigger events is that although the application says that the relevant date is the 30th of November 2020, the council's own system referred to an application date of the 13th of January 2020, and that is in your agenda report as well, somewhere. Let me see if I can find it where I saw it. Yes, that's referred to on agenda page 15. Now, if the relevant date is the 30th of November, then you've got these two trigger events which have been drawn to your attention and represented on that map. But if the application date is the 13th of January 2020, then that's arguably before the application was lodged. The application was being lodged at that particular time, and it's difficult to know exactly whether this the 13th of January, that was before the 13th of January, the relevant date, or after the 13th of January. But clearly the adoption of the allocation was also was occurring in January, and I think almost within a few days of the 13th of January as well. So,
Mr. Moreland, you've gone over time. Is it okay if I just ask at the end, I'll ask the officer to clarify about these dates?
I don't oppose, I'm not opposing the recommendation to hold a non-statutory public inquiry. I'm simply highlighting that the chronology of the trigger events will be a fairly crucial part of that process. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Moreland. Two things came out of that. First of all, thank you for passing on Mr. Swanee's apologies due to illness. I think we could minute that somewhere, couldn't we, Kieran, that the applicant sent his apologies for not attending a meeting and is not well enough to attend. On the dates of the trigger events, do you have some chapter and verse at your fingertips, Janice? I mean, clearly, if there is any confusion about these dates, all we can do at this stage, I think, is to make sure that we've got it sort of fathomed by the time we get to any further process.
Of course, thank you, and thank you for raising that, Mr. Moreland. So the application to register land as a town or village green was first submitted in January 2020. When we receive the applications, we do the consultations with the planning authorities regarding planning trigger events which might be in place on the land. At which time, so in January 2020, the draft Wiltshire Housing Sites Allocation Plan was a trigger event over part of the land. The application was returned at that time where it was thought that trigger event affected all of the land. The application was again submitted in June 2020, at which time the draft Wiltshire Housing Sites Allocation Plan was adopted and became a different trigger event. And additionally, then we had the advertised and the planning application for 180 houses as a second trigger event at that time. And again, the application was returned because it was considered that it affected all of the land. However, the application was then resubmitted in November 2020, and the same two trigger events were in place, but it was found that they affected only part of the land, so the application could continue to be determined on that part of the land unaffected by the trigger events. So despite the delay in processing the application, which is unfortunate, there always has been a planning trigger event in place on that part of the land. So at no point would it have been possible to consider the application land in full.
Thank you. Which was the date when Mr. Swanee submitted his application for a town or village green?
So that would have been the January 2020 it originally came in.
Do we have an exact date in January 2020?
Sorry, yes. So that was dated the 13th of January 2020.
So that's when he made the application.
That's correct.
And which of the trigger events came before that?
So originally in January 2020, we had the draft Wiltshire Housing Sites Allocation Plan.
And what date in January 2020 was that?
That was already in place at that time. So the draft,
That was before January 2020.
that's correct, yes.
And do we have a very approximate date for when it was published? Okay, well, a member of the public is telling us it was 2017, and we're not supposed to hear you, I think, at this point, but I mean, we'll get officers to check that. But I think that the message from this discussion is that by the time we get to any further process, we just need to have some exact dates lined up for anyone taking the decision. Right, can we then move back to the list of things that we're going to be doing? And the first thing is to go to the local member who may wish to make some comments before we go into debate, who may or prefer simply to go into debate. Over to you, Councillor Viger.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm happy to go straight to debate, and I would like to propose that we follow the officer's recommendation. I represent Trowbridge Grove, which, as we've heard, is identified as the locality in respect of this application. And as we've heard in Wiltshire Council terms, it is technically in the Southwick division, but it abuts the Trowbridge Grove area, and Trowbridge Grove is home to 44 of the 49 witnesses who submitted evidence. So in simple terms, the fields are used by Grove residents. And the application turns mainly on whether the area has been used for 20 years for sports and pastimes without stay or let. Some supported statements do make this assertion. For example, one says, I've lived opposite these fields for over 45 years. During this time, myself and family have used them for walking, running and picking blackberries. I've great sympathy with those who use the fields and want to preserve this valuable green space. However, I'm taking a balanced approach, and I recognise that the landowners' representatives have also mounted detailed arguments in objection. The officers, and very grateful to Janice and the team, have sifted through the evidence and produced a 300-page report. I respect their evidence and I support their judgment in concluding that the facts are in dispute and that an inquiry is therefore the proper course of action. Clearly, what is needed now is a more forensic and inquisitorial approach than that which we can take as a committee or the council can take as a Commons registration authority, which, as we've heard, has no investigative powers. We're used to debating on the basis of established facts, whereas what's required here is a process to elicit all of the facts, examine the evidence on both sides, and facilitate cross-examination. I particularly noticed the words of the Supreme Court Justice Lady Arden quoted in the officer's report, saying, in cases where it is clear to the registration authority that the application or any objection to it has no substance, the course it should take will be plain. If, however, that is not the case, the authority may properly decide, pursuant to its powers under Section 11 of the 1972 Act, to hold an inquiry. And I would agree that in this case, neither the application nor the objection are completely without substance, and therefore that an inquiry is merited. I also recognise the risk that faces the council as set out in the report, namely that if the decision were to be challenged and it were to be found that the authority had failed to pursue its duty by making a decision without an inquiry, then it would be liable to complaints submitted through the complaints procedure, potentially leading to complaints to the Ombudsman and ultimately potentially a request for a judicial review. The inquiry we hear will cost £12,000 to £15,000, but I think that is reasonable given the impact on either the landowner or the residents, depending on how the decision goes. I think that Councillor Hill's suggestion of a compromise is a promising one, but it's not one that can be formally agreed today. So I would suggest that we resolve to have an inquiry with the understanding that it would not be needed if the parties can come to an agreement that results in the application being withdrawn. And I would suggest that a little time might be left before incurring any expenditure to allow that possibility to be considered. So I therefore propose that we accept the officer's recommendation as set out on page 50 and frame it as a resolution such that the minutes would read, I don't know if you want to put it on the screen at all, but the minutes would read as follows: the committee resolved to appoint an independent inspector on behalf of the CRA to preside over a non-statutory public inquiry at which the evidence of all parties will be heard and tested through cross-examination to produce an advisory report and recommendation regarding the application to the planning committee to assist the CRA in its determination of the application, etc.
So is that slightly different from the officer's recommendation in the report?
No, I'm suggesting that we simply, what we see on the screen, that we simply put it in the minutes saying the committee resolved, take the first line of that out and to say the committee resolved to appoint an independent inspector, and then the rest of it runs as it stands.
Okay, right. Is there a seconder for that? Councillor Ridout, are you seconding that? Okay. Well, that's the motion that's on the table. It sounds very reasonable, I think. Does anyone wish to speak for or against that before we go to the vote? I see nobody indicating. So would all in favour of the recommendation please indicate? That appears to be unanimous, so I don't need to ask if there are any others. Thank you very much indeed, everybody, for your attendance. And we will no doubt... what you said, Councillor Weiger, about not rushing into setting this up, officers heard, Janice will have heard that, she is nodding. I think it's highly unlikely that she'll be rushing off to book up the inquiry in the next few weeks anyway, but I mean, clearly, there normally is a delay, isn't there, Janice, in these things? So I think Councillor Weiger is just encouraging us not to rush any faster than we ever do. Right, many thanks, everybody, and that's the end of the meeting.